Tokyo, August 1944. The summer heat pressed down like a weight, thick and suffocating, as the cicadas screamed beyond the shuttered windows of the Imperial Army General Staff Headquarters. Inside, under dim light and the constant whir of ceiling fans, a handful of intelligence officers sat around a long wooden table. Before them lay a sealed envelope, stamped with crimson ink. Top secret, report from Field Agent N23 Rangoon Sector. The colonel in charge slid it open with the slow precision of ritual. Inside were neatly typed pages, field assessments on the American tanks that had appeared in Burma and the Pacific Islands. The opening line read simply, "Enemy armor remains tactically limited. No new significant improvement observed in the M4 Sherman or the M4A3 variant." The room exhaled in quiet relief. For months, Japan's military leadership had grown increasingly anxious about American production. Reports from the Pacific hinted at overwhelming numbers of Allied tanks, seemingly endless lines of Sherman machines landing on island beaches. But here, at last, was confirmation that the enemy's technology had stagnated. The Sherman, the report claimed, was still slow, lightly armored, and easy to destroy with Type 1 and Type 3 anti-tank guns. A deception was unfolding, and no one in that room knew it. The data that crossed the ocean from Burma to Tokyo had been filtered, twisted, and mistranslated through multiple layers of communication. The original observer, an embedded Japanese operative reporting from captured or observed Sherman wrecks, had never seen the newest models. The M4A3, with its upgraded 4GA engine and reinforced armor, had already begun replacing older variants across the Pacific. But by the time his report reached the home islands, its details were months out of date. To the men of Japan's general staff, it was gospel. They believed their spies. That night, under the haze of tobacco smoke, the report was copied and distributed to the Army Technical Bureau. Engineers studied the numbers, comparing them to the Imperial Army's own tanks, the Type 97 Chiha, the Type 1 Chihi. The verdict was reassuring. The Americans, they concluded, still favored quantity over quality. The Sherman might be plentiful, but it was clumsy, vulnerable, and unfit for jungle warfare. By dawn, the conclusion had already reached the desk of General Hideki Tojo's successors. The Empire's armored divisions, already reeling from defeats in Saipan and New Guinea, would not receive urgent upgrades. The existing tanks were deemed sufficient. But in the jungles of the Pacific, nothing was sufficient anymore. In the months that followed, the illusion deepened. Japanese intelligence continued to rely on fragmented observations from Southeast Asia, often gathered by desperate field agents with limited access to Allied hardware. Many of these agents relied on rumor, on second-hand descriptions from local informants or captured documents. Some even based their technical data on destroyed tanks, machines that had already been gutted by fire, their armor warped and their engines missing. From these scraps, Japan built an entire doctrine of misunderstanding. The M4 Sherman, they believed, was prone to overheating in tropical climates. The M4A3's new Ford engine, they said, consumed fuel at twice the normal rate. And most importantly, they believed the armor still could not withstand Japan's 47mm anti-tank rounds. It was a comfortable fiction, one that fit the Empire's worldview. Since the beginning of the war, Japanese military philosophy had placed faith not in machines but in spirit. The Bushido Code, the belief that courage and willpower could overcome any material disadvantage, was not just ideology, it was strategy. When faced with reports of superior American production, the High Command found solace in the idea that their enemies' weapons were weak. They could not afford to believe otherwise. In London and Washington, the Allies knew better. They had studied Japan's intelligence habits. Their obsession with morale over data, their slow transmission networks, their reliance on local agents cut off from modern information. Unlike the Germans, whose abwehr had been systematically turned by the British, the Japanese intelligence apparatus was undone not by spies, but by isolation. Their empire had stretched too far, too fast. Communication lines from Burma to Tokyo took weeks. Reports were coded, decoded, and reinterpreted by layers of officers, each adjusting the information to fit what Tokyo wanted to hear. By the time it reached the top, the truth was gone. On paper, Japan still believed the M4 Sherman was a cumbersome relic of Western overconfidence. In reality, it had evolved into a flexible, efficient war machine, the backbone of Allied armor from Europe to the Pacific. The M4A3, powered by a robust V8 engine, could climb slopes, cross rivers, and sustain long operations without the breakdowns that plagued Japanese vehicles. And it was coming for them. As American forces advanced across the Pacific Islands, the illusion began to crack. On Saipan, Japanese soldiers reported tanks that moved faster than expected, whose armor withstood direct hits. Commanders dismissed these claims as battlefield exaggeration. When the same reports came from Peleliu, they called them coincidences. By the time of Leyte, they could no longer deny what was happening, but it was too late to change course. The empire had already bet its survival on lies. Inside the intelligence bureau, there were still men who questioned the data. One of them, Lieutenant Colonel Kenji Tanaka, filed an internal memo in late 1944 warning that American armor performance appears significantly improved, and that previous intelligence may no longer reflect current reality. The memo was ignored. His superiors noted in the margins, unsubstantiated, contradicts existing analysis. The existing analysis was sacred. The machine of deception didn't need an enemy to sustain it. It fueled itself, with tradition, with hierarchy, with fear of contradiction. No officer wanted to be the one to suggest that Japan had fallen behind. And so, the reports continued, confident, certain, wrong. In Tokyo's war rooms, the generals still discussed tactics as if the battlefield obeyed old rules. They spoke of ambushes, close combat, the superiority of Japanese maneuver. But war had changed. The Allies fought with speed, with coordination, with endless supplies of tanks that didn't need to be the best. They only needed to work. The Japanese army was still fighting a 1930s war against a 1940s world. And it was fighting blind. The consequences would arrive soon, in the black sand of Iwo Jima, in the shattered hills of Okinawa, when the myth of the weak Sherman met the reality of industrial war. But that summer night in Tokyo, no one could hear the engines yet. They were still thousands of miles away, waiting to make the lie real. By late 1944, the illusion reached the front lines. In the jungles and beaches of the Philippines, Japanese officers still quoted the same reports sent months earlier from Burma. The M4 Sherman, they told their troops, was clumsy. Its armor thin. Its engine unreliable. Against the Emperor's steel and spirit, it would fall like the others. But the war no longer matched the words. When American forces landed at Leyte in October, the island trembled under the sound of hundreds of Shermans rolling ashore. Their engines roared through the swampy terrain, their tracks tearing through mud that would have swallowed Japanese tanks whole. To the defenders it seemed impossible. The Shermans didn't stop. They didn't bog down. They moved with mechanical precision, supported by aircraft and artillery that struck with mathematical timing. The Type 97 Chiha tanks waiting in ambush opened fire. Their 47mm shells pinged uselessly off the Sherman's sloped armor. The first wave of American tanks absorbed the hits, returned fire, and advanced. Within minutes, entire Japanese positions were engulfed in flame. What the Japanese command had called vulnerable was proving unstoppable. From the hills above Ormoc Bay, surviving officers radioed back reports of disaster. They described Shermans advancing through minefields, climbing ridges, and surviving direct hits from weapons that should have destroyed them. They begged for heavier guns. The answer from Tokyo was silence. Tokyo still believed the lies. To the Imperial General Staff, these battlefield reports were isolated incidents. They cited earlier intelligence to claim that enemy tanks remain weak to concentrated fire. Orders were issued to hold ground and conserve ammunition. The truth was burning in front of them. On Leyte and Luzon, Japanese tank crews soon realized the futility of their machines. The Chiha, once adequate in China and Malaya, was a relic now. Its thin armor could not stand against a single Sherman shell. Its 47mm gun barely scratched the paint of the M4A3. In desperation, crews resorted to suicidal charges, ramming Shermans head-on or detonating explosives beneath them. The American tanks rolled on, scarred but intact. In Tokyo, the intelligence files still painted a different picture. They reported severe Allied losses in tank engagements. They noted mechanical unreliability in tropical conditions. They called the Sherman's success temporary. It was a lie they had told themselves for too long to stop believing. By early 1945, as the Allies prepared for Iwo Jima, the Japanese war machine was collapsing under contradictions. Their intelligence network, isolated and crumbling, continued to generate reports that no longer matched reality. Field agents sent messages days or weeks late, often relying on rumors carried by retreating troops. The most optimistic reports were the ones that reached Tokyo first. The truth, ugly, undeniable truth, traveled slower. On Iwo Jima, the truth landed with the U.S. Marines. The Sherman tanks that crawled across the black volcanic sand were not the same machines the Japanese had studied 2 years earlier. They were M4A3 variants, reinforced, refitted, and battle-hardened. Some carried flamethrowers. Others were modified for beach landings, their hulls sealed, their treads adapted to the terrain. Japanese gunners opened fire with 47mm and 75mm guns, the same weapons they had been told could destroy the Sherman with ease. But as the battle dragged on, it became clear, the old calculations were lies. The shells ricocheted, the armor held, and the tanks kept advancing through fire and smoke. From the command bunkers deep under Mount Suribachi, General Kuribayashi's officers listened in disbelief. "The enemy's tanks are far stronger than reported," one message read. "They do not stop. Our shells cannot destroy them." The message reached Tokyo. And again it was ignored. In the War Ministry, the data analysts reviewed the report and dismissed it as an exaggeration born of confusion. They referenced earlier documents confirming that the Sherman's armor is inferior to German standards. The logic was circular. The intelligence must be correct because it was official, and if reality disagreed, then reality must be mistaken. The empire had trapped itself in its own narrative. The failure was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. For years, Japan had believed that the spirit of its soldiers could overcome the enemy's machines. They viewed technology not as a path to victory, but as a symbol of decadence. The Sherman was supposed to embody that decadence, heavy, material, soulless. But as the island battles raged, that illusion collapsed under the sound of engines and steel. The machine had no spirit, but it had endurance. And endurance was all it needed. By the time Okinawa was invaded in April 1945, even the lowest-ranking Japanese soldiers knew the truth. The Shermans were not weak. They were relentless. They moved through terrain once thought impassable, coordinated with infantry and aircraft in ways the Japanese had never mastered. The Type 95s and Chihas that faced them were shredded before they could close range. Every tank destroyed became a lesson written in blood. In Tokyo, the intelligence officers continued their work in silence. They still sent summaries to the Imperial headquarters, still compared numbers, still wrote conclusions. But between the lines, doubt began to grow. A few whispered that the intelligence system had failed, that the Americans had outgrown every analysis, that the empire was fighting an enemy it no longer understood. But such thoughts were dangerous. To question the data was to question the empire. And to question the empire was treason. So the reports continued. So did the dying. At Okinawa, the Shermans advanced behind relentless artillery fire. Every Japanese gun position was marked, shelled, and then erased. The defenders who survived found themselves staring down rows of tanks they had been told were obsolete. They fired until their barrels overheated, until their guns cracked, until the silence swallowed them. From a distance, the Americans saw the battlefield differently. They didn't know about the lies in Tokyo. They didn't know that the men shooting at them were guided by reports months old, written by agents who had never seen a modern Sherman. They only saw resistance, fierce, hopeless, and unending. When the battle ended, the Imperial Army had lost not only its soldiers but its illusions. Captured documents from Okinawa showed the same patterns, the same flawed intelligence summaries, the same misplaced confidence, the same underestimation of the enemy's machines. In May 1945, as the empire's final defenses crumbled, a senior intelligence officer in Tokyo wrote one last note in his logbook. "Our understanding of the enemy's armor was wrong. Perhaps it was always wrong. We believed we were seeing the truth. But truth requires eyes that can see." The next day, the building that housed his department was destroyed in an air raid. His note survived, charred but legible. It was a fitting epitaph for a system that had gone blind. By the summer of 1945, truth was beginning to surface, but it came too late to matter. The Japanese intelligence network, once proud of its discipline and secrecy, was now a patchwork of silence. The empire's outer territories had fallen, its agents cut off, its communication lines fractured by Allied dominance of the seas and skies. Messages that once took days now took weeks if they arrived at all. In the intelligence bureau in Tokyo, the walls were closing in. Entire departments had been relocated underground to avoid air raids. The air smelled of damp paper and kerosene. The once endless flow of reports from Southeast Asia and the Pacific had dwindled to a trickle, half-burned, half-true fragments of a war already lost. Among the analysts who remained, doubt had begun to whisper. They had watched the news of Okinawa with disbelief. The reports from surviving units described the same tanks, the same M4 Sherman, the same M4A3, appearing in greater numbers than any estimate had predicted. Some analysts calculated that the Americans must have produced tens of thousands. Others dismissed it as exaggeration. But one man refused to let it go. Major Hiroshi Nakamura had served in intelligence since before the war, fluent in English and German, trained to analyze enemy equipment. He had seen captured Shermans in China in 1942 and knew their weaknesses. But when he examined wreckage from the Okinawa front, something caught his eye. The engine was not the same. The armor was thicker. The design was improved. It was an M4A3. In that moment, he realized the Empire's entire intelligence foundation had been built on outdated ghosts. He wrote a report. 50 pages, handwritten, with sketches and technical comparisons. His conclusion was blunt. Our previous assessments of American armor are obsolete. The Sherman and M4A3 are superior in reliability and production efficiency. Our anti-tank doctrine must be revised immediately. He submitted it to his superiors. It never reached them. The document was intercepted, marked defeatist, and buried in a drawer. Officially, the Bureau's stance remained unchanged. Enemy armor remains inferior to German standards and can be countered through tactical ingenuity. Tactical ingenuity. It was a polite phrase for denial. Outside, the world was collapsing. American B-29s roared over Tokyo nightly, turning the capital into a sea of fire. The Empire's industrial base was gone, its supply lines shattered. Yet inside the underground rooms of the General Staff, officers still clung to their data tables, their charts, their phantom confidence that numbers on paper meant something. But the numbers were lies. The Japanese intelligence service, like the Reichsabwehr before it, had become a victim of its own certainty. The problem wasn't that their spies were incompetent. It was that their system no longer allowed the truth to exist. Reports that contradicted policy were dismissed as errors. Analysts who raised questions were demoted, reassigned, or quietly silenced. The Empire demanded harmony, not honesty. And harmony had become fatal. In the ruins of Manila, captured documents revealed how deeply the rot had spread. American officers found Japanese field reports describing malfunctioning Sherman engines, frequent breakdowns, and thin frontal armor. Yet the wrecks on the battlefield told another story. The engines were intact, the armor strong, the tanks fully operational even after days of fighting. It wasn't just a failure of observation, it was a failure of belief. By the time American forces approached Japan's home islands, the M4A3 had become an unstoppable symbol of industrial war. The Japanese tanks that remained were relics, slow, underarmed, fragile. Some units prepared for the final invasion by digging their tanks into the earth, turning them into stationary bunkers. They no longer believed they could fight on equal terms. In Tokyo, Nakamura tried again. This time, he sent his report directly to a senior liaison in the Army Technical Bureau. He included photographs taken by reconnaissance pilots, showing columns of Shermans moving across Okinawa's ridges. He noted the distinctive rear vents of the M4A3's V8 engine, the thicker mantlets, the improved turret armor. He ended with a single line: "If we misunderstand the enemy, we do not fight him, we only fight ourselves." No one replied. 2 weeks later, the office was destroyed in an air raid. Nakamura survived, but his report was lost. The irony was brutal. For years, Japanese intelligence had sought precision. Exact calibers, armor thickness, production numbers. They had measured every inch of the enemy's machine. But they had never measured their own blindness. The Americans, meanwhile, understood the war in entirely different terms. They didn't see the Sherman as perfect. They saw it as functional, scalable, adaptable. When one model failed, another improved. When one was destroyed, another replaced it. The system, not the individual machine, was their strength. The Japanese, bound by hierarchy and faith, had no such flexibility. Their reports might have been accurate once, but once accuracy became inconvenient, it was erased. And so, when the war reached its final stage, Japan entered it with eyes closed. In July 1945, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Kyushu, Japanese analysts still briefed their commanders using pre-1944 data. The M4 Sherman, they claimed, remained vulnerable to shape charge attacks and heat damage. They warned of its numbers, yes, but not its evolution. They failed to mention that the M4A3 could run nearly twice as far with better armor and improved fire control systems. When American reconnaissance planes photographed assembly yards filled with Shermans awaiting deployment, the images were dismissed as propaganda. Impossible, one colonel said. No nation could build that many tanks. The same words had been spoken in Berlin the year before. In those final weeks, Japan's intelligence divisions became little more than ghosts, processing paperwork for a war already lost. When the atomic bombs fell, most of them were underground, unaware that the empire they served was already gone. After the surrender, American investigators walked through the ruins of the General Staff building. They found filing cabinets full of reports, all marked with the same confident tone. Enemy tank, no change. No major threat. They found Nakamura's name on several drafts, his handwriting precise and calm. In one margin, beside a chart comparing American and Japanese tank models, he had written 4 words in red ink. We never wanted truth. It was not bitterness. It was clarity. The tragedy of Japan's intelligence failure wasn't merely that their data was wrong, it was that their culture made it impossible to accept when it was right. For every tank destroyed, for every battle lost, there had been a chance to see. But they chose not to. As the occupying forces catalogued the documents, one American officer reportedly remarked, "They were brilliant men. But brilliance without humility sees nothing." It was the perfect epitaph for an empire that mistook pride for insight. The myth of the weak Sherman had done its job. It didn't just blind the German Reich, it blinded Japan too, thousands of miles away, through the same weapon no one could defend against. The illusion of certainty. And as the empire burned, that illusion finally shattered. August 15, 1945. The voice of the emperor, faint and trembling, drifted through the static of 1,000 radios. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their ruler speak. His words were veiled in formality, but the message was unmistakable. The war was over. In the bunkers beneath Tokyo, men who had spent years constructing illusions sat in silence. The maps on their walls meant nothing now. The pins, the markers, the red arrows, every symbol of control had dissolved. When the American occupation forces entered the capital weeks later, they came not only for weapons but for information. Intelligence officers, linguists and engineers combed through archives that had survived the bombings. What they found was a paper empire, shelves of neatly organized reports, stamped with confidence, filled with errors. In one surviving folder, dated March 1945, Enemy Armored Capabilities, investigators found detailed charts comparing Japanese and American tanks. The columns for the M4 Sherman and M4A3 were filled with assumptions. Armor thickness, gun performance, engine durability. But beside each entry, the Americans added red pencil marks and quiet notations: incorrect, obsolete, unverified. It was like reading the autopsy of an empire that had died of self-deception. When questioned, the remaining Japanese officers offered the same answers. We had no new data. Communications were cut. The agents were unreliable. But the truth ran deeper than logistics. They had not just lost contact with their spies, they had lost contact with reality itself. In a dim interrogation room, under the cold glare of fluorescent light, Major Hiroshi Nakamura sat across from an American analyst. The war was over, and for the first time, there was nothing left to protect. The American officer slid a photograph across the table. It showed a row of M4A3 Shermans, freshly painted, rolling through the ruins of Manila. "Did you ever see one of these?" he asked. Nakamura studied the photo for a long time before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "But not soon enough." He explained how his reports had been dismissed, how the Bureau had filtered truth into something comfortable. He spoke without bitterness, only exhaustion. "We believed that understanding the enemy was an act of weakness," he said. "So we replaced understanding with faith." The American listened, then closed the folder. There was nothing more to say. Elsewhere, in warehouses filled with the ashes of the war, American analysts cataloged every Japanese intelligence file. The scale of the failure stunned them. Dozens of reports repeated the same false data about the Sherman: its armor too thin, its gun too short, its engine too fragile. The same lines appeared across years, copied and recopied, never challenged. It wasn't just one mistake. It was a system of mistakes, self-sustaining, self-reinforcing, immune to correction. For the Allies, the discovery was more than historical curiosity. It was a warning. Intelligence, they realized, was never only about gathering facts. It was about the willingness to question them. In Germany, the Allies had found similar patterns: false confidence, filtered data, arrogance dressed as certainty. Now in Japan they saw the same disease, an empire undone not by the enemy's strength, but by its own refusal to doubt. When the U.S. Army technical teams examined Japan's surviving tanks, the Chi-He, the Chinu, they found designs that might have been competitive years earlier. But they had been trapped by indecision, by resource shortages, and by a leadership that refused to admit inferiority. The engineers had built what they could, not what they should. The irony was unmistakable. Both the Germans and the Japanese had underestimated the same machine, the M4 Sherman. Both had dismissed it as crude, mass-produced, unworthy of fear. And both had been destroyed by it. In Tokyo, the occupation forces repurposed what remained of the General Staff building. The rooms where generals once debated the weakness of American tanks now housed Allied officers reviewing captured archives. The old intelligence symbols, the red sun, the stylized kanji of the Army Bureau, were replaced by new labels: evaluated, corrected, declassified. Outside, the city lay in ruins. Inside, history was being rewritten line by line. One American report on Japanese intelligence concluded bluntly: the empire's analytical apparatus was crippled by ideological conformity. Reports were shaped to satisfy expectation rather than observation. This resulted in chronic underestimation of enemy capabilities, particularly in the field of armored warfare. In other words, they lied to themselves. Nakamura was released months later. He returned to a Tokyo that no longer recognized him, a city rebuilt from ash and silence. He found work translating American technical manuals, helping reconstruct Japan's post-war industry. Sometimes, he would stop when reading about engines or metallurgy and remember the nights he spent drawing tank schematics for a war that was already lost. He once told a younger colleague, "In the end, we were never defeated by the enemy's tanks. We were defeated by our own certainty." That certainty had been absolute. Even as the atomic bombs fell, Japan's military believed that the United States could not sustain such attacks, that its spirit would waver. The same blindness that misread the Sherman had misread everything else: industrial capacity, logistics, willpower. When the truth finally arrived, it came not as revelation but as ruin. The Allied analysts continued their work into 1946. In a classified summary, they compared the intelligence networks of Germany and Japan. The conclusion was striking. Both powers had fallen victim to their own assumptions, but in different ways. Germany had been deceived by the enemy. Japan had deceived itself. It was a quiet distinction, but a fatal one. For every empire that rises, there is a moment when knowledge becomes faith, when analysis becomes doctrine, when questioning becomes betrayal. That moment came for Japan not in 1945, but years earlier, when the first report declared the Sherman inferior. It was a small lie. It felt harmless. It felt convenient. And it destroyed them. When the Allied occupation authorities published the post-war white paper on Japanese intelligence, few outside the military noticed a footnote at the end of one chapter. It quoted an anonymous Japanese officer reflecting on the war's outcome: "We learned too late that truth is not patriotic." No one knew who had written it. But in the dim archives where those words were filed, beside photographs of burned cities and shattered tanks, the lesson was clear. The M4 Sherman and its successor, the M4A3, had been underestimated not because they were invincible, but because their enemies refused to believe something so ordinary could be so effective. They wanted a monster to fear. They got a machine that simply worked. And sometimes, that is what makes a weapon truly unstoppable. The war was over, but its silence was louder than the bombs. Across the ashes of Asia, Japan lay broken, not just in cities or in armies but in certainty. The empire that had once believed itself unshakable now lived under occupation, its institutions dismantled, its ideals stripped bare. In the new dawn of 1946, the files of the Imperial Army Intelligence Bureau were opened to sunlight for the first time. Pages once marked top secret fluttered in the breeze of open windows. The men who had guarded them for years now stood by as translators, their pride replaced with quiet resignation. Among the stacks of fading paper were hundreds of intelligence assessments, detailed, precise, wrong. Charts comparing the Type 97 to the Sherman. Reports rating enemy tank firepower as moderate. Tables of expected production limits that underestimated American output by tenfold. Each report was a brick in the wall that had sealed their fate. The Americans called it a failure of analysis. But it was something deeper than that. The Japanese intelligence system had been built not to question but to confirm. It had confused loyalty with truth. And when reality no longer fit the story simply rewrote reality. The lie about the M4 Sherman was only one of many, but it was symbolic. It represented everything the empire believed about itself, that willpower could surpass machinery, that purity could defeat progress, that belief was stronger than fact. Those beliefs burned with the empire. In the quiet months that followed surrender, a few surviving officers began to reflect. Some wrote memoirs. Others disappeared into obscurity. But among the files of the American occupation archives, one statement stood out. It was written by a former intelligence colonel, whose name was later redacted. "We were blind not because we lacked eyes but because we refused to look. The enemy's tank was not our downfall. Our own pride was." He was right. The M4 Sherman and its later M4A3 variant had never been secret weapons. They were practical, mass-produced machines. Simple, reliable, built by workers who understood that a weapon's true strength lay not in perfection but in persistence. While Japan's engineers designed intricate mechanisms that broke under pressure, America built tanks that could be repaired with a wrench and a will. That difference defined the war. And in a way it still defines history. The failure of Japan's intelligence network was not unique. Every great power, in its time, faces the same temptation: to believe in its own narrative, to filter information until it says what leaders want to hear. It begins with one convenient falsehood, then another, until the truth itself becomes the enemy. For Japan, that process began the day a Spies report claimed the Sherman was weak. 4 months, that lie traveled through radio waves, across oceans, through desks and minds, until it became doctrine. And doctrine kills more quietly than any weapon. When the Allied analysts finally compiled their post-war summary, they wrote a single line that captured it all. The enemy's greatest vulnerability was faith in its own infallibility. That faith had led millions to their deaths. Years later, in 1953, a former intelligence officer named Nakamura visited an American museum exhibit in Tokyo. Behind the glass stood an M4A3 Sherman, rusted, weathered, but intact. He walked slowly around it, tracing the lines of its armor with his eyes. The plaque beside it read, "The workhorse of victory." For a long moment he stood in silence. Then he whispered almost to himself, "We called you weak." The words carried no bitterness, only clarity. He knew that the tank before him had not just been an enemy, it had been a mirror. In its simple design he saw everything Japan had refused to become: adaptable, humble, pragmatic. History is not kind to arrogance, but it never forgets humility. For decades after the war, historians would study the failures of Japanese intelligence. Their reliance on outdated data, their slow communications, their cultural resistance to dissent. Yet beneath all the analysis, one truth remained: they had fallen in love with their own certainty. And in war, certainty is the most seductive illusion of all. The British deceived the Germans through manipulation. The Japanese deceived themselves through pride. Both paths led to ruin. In the end, the M4 Sherman's greatest weapon was not its gun or its armor, it was the blindness of those who refused to understand it. It rolled across continents, through deserts and jungles, across Europe and the Pacific, not because it was unstoppable but because no one believed it could be. And that disbelief became its shield. Even now, in the museums and fields where Shermans rest, their steel carries the echoes of that irony. They were ordinary machines that defeated extraordinary delusion. The lesson remains unchanged. Empires fall when they replace truth with comfort, when they choose belief over doubt, when they value pride more than accuracy. The cost is always the same. For Germany it was Berlin in ruins, For Japan it was Hiroshima and Leyte. The tank that both underestimated became the ghost in every lesson of military history, a reminder that information, not firepower, decides the fate of nations. And somewhere, beneath the dust of time, the voices of those long-dead analysts still whisper their final confession. We did not lose to the Sherman. We lost to ourselves. The camera lingers on the silent form of a rusting M4A3, its paint peeling, its tracks frozen in stillness. The sound fades. Only the wind remains, carrying the weight of what was once believed. Then silence.